And there you have it, folks. Welcome to Week 6 of the NFL season. Of course, my name is Drew Garino, here to bring you the League of Legends Fantasy Football predictions. That song was brought to you by our own Steve DeFerrari, playing off his team name a little bit with a little U2 Bloody Sunday. Now, that majestic shot that you just saw was a beautiful downtown Sunrise, Florida, home of the Florida Panthers. So that stadium was off in the distance. That's BB&T Center, home of the Florida Panthers. So, welcome from Florida, here again to bring you the Week 6 NFL action. First, looking back at last week, a 3-2 week for me. Overall, 20-5 pristine clip. Hopefully I can stay at that pace for the remainder of the season. Now, looking at this week's matchups, Sean comes in at 1-4 versus Adam, who is 3-2. Sean has Matt Forte going at Detroit. Love the matchup. Should see a lot of activity both on the ground and through the air, FedEx, if you will. Matt Forte should see a ton of targets in this game. He's been pretty good, actually. I shouldn't say that. He's been up and down this season, but I like for him to have a strong game on Sunday. For the downside, Dorell Green Beckham. Guy that's going to be fantasy relevant in maybe the end of the year or next year, but not necessarily this week. He's got Miami at home, favorable matchup. However, can't really be trusted. Hasn't seen a lot of targets in his action at this point in the year. Sean does have some bye week blues with his wide receiver position, so that is certainly a concern there. But Dorell Green Beckham, for me, is not a guy that I will be starting in any team. Adam has Antonio Gates, who he welcomed back from a suspension, had a big game on Monday Night Football against Pittsburgh Steelers in a losing effort. He has Green Bay on the road this week. I like the matchup. I think Green Bay will get out to an early lead, so that means Phillip Rivers will be looking for Antonio Gates very often throughout the game. So I like for Antonio Gates to have a big game for Adam. On the downside, I don't like Jeremy Hill. He only had 10 touches last week. Very, very concerning. I know Adam is also starting Gio Bernard, so really going to be working against each other, but definitely a huge blow for Adam losing Jamal Charles on a non-contact injury for the season. But Jeremy Hill is at Buffalo this week. I don't like the matchup, and I don't like the trend there of his non-touches out of the backfield. Looking at it as a whole, going with the upset here. Sean, I have you winning this game, so let's see if I'm right about that. But I do like Sean's roster this week. I think it's going to be a pretty evenly matched matchup, but I will take Sean to move to 2-4. Next matchup we're going to look at is Ryan, who comes in at a blistering 5-0 pace against Bill, who unfortunately lost last week to bring his record to 0-5. Ryan returns Marshawn Lynch at home against Carolina. That could be a low-scoring affair, and I like for Marshawn Lynch to receive a lot of touches. I think he will find the end zone in that particular ball game, so I like Marshawn Lynch this week for Ryan. Also, on the downside for Ryan, I don't like Kendall Wright, who is home against Miami. Decent year, decent quarterback, just don't love it. I don't love him in the flex position for Ryan. I know he's a little bit banged up. He's got some bye weeks going on right now. So I don't like Kendall Wright this week. I'm not favorable about that matchup. Bill, on the other hand, is starting Calvin Johnson, of course, at wide receiver. He is playing the Bears this week. Calvin has been up and down also, very similar to the Detroit offense, but I like for him to break out in a big way against the Chicago Bears, a team he's done favorably well against in the last couple of years. So Calvin Johnson for me is a guy that I look at and say he's in line for a big game, and I think this is the game that he's going to get it. On the downside for Bill, a guy that we really haven't talked about a lot this year that has just shown a lot of decline. He didn't look great last week in a winning effort, but Peyton Manning at Cleveland, never thought that would be an unfavorable matchup. Cleveland's actually done pretty well against the quarterbacks this year. Joe Flacco did have a good game against them last week, but that was without Joe Hayden. I believe he will be returning this week. So Peyton Manning for me is a guy who actually has more interceptions than touchdowns, 6-7. So I don't like his trend, and I don't like for him in a 1 o'clock Eastern time zone game as well. Another factor for all you bettors out there. But looking at this matchup in its totality, I will take Ryan to advance to 6-0 and stay atop the League of Legends standings. The next matchup we'll look at is Bud, who comes in at a 4-1 record. Again, doesn't think he's going to lose again. He is playing the surprise winner of last week, Steve DeFerrari, the winner of the matchup of the week, who comes in with a 2-3 record to this week's action. Bud has Aaron Rodgers certainly going against San Diego. That is a home game. Rodgers actually threw 2 interceptions at home, his first interception in quite some time in a home ball game. I believe he will come back in a big way. I am expecting Aaron Rodgers to have a monster game, possibly his best game of the season. He is going to do so at the expense of the San Diego defense, which is coming off a short rest, having played in the Monday night game. A guy I don't like for Bud, Julius Thomas. He came back a little bit unexpectedly last week. They weren't really anticipating he was going to return to the lineup. He did. He was not really a factor. He only had 2 catches for 20 yards in that ball game. He does have a favorable matchup against Houston. Blake Bortles right now is also banged up, so I don't see Julius Thomas having a productive fantasy performance. He is projected at almost 12 points. I don't think he's going to come anywhere close to that amount for Bud. Now, looking at Steve's roster, I'm going to stick with the tight end position. Larry Donnell at Philadelphia. Right now, the Giants are beat up a little bit in terms of their receiving core. Beckham was injured a little bit last week. He will play this week. Ruben Randall is definitely questionable for this week as well. With that being said, Larry Donnell actually had a lot of targets, especially towards the end of the ball game. He had that big touchdown to win the game for them. So I like Larry Donnell to have another big game at the expense of the Philly defense. Again, staying with the tight ends, right now he's in the lineup. I don't anticipate that he will start for Steve, but right now there's a couple of open spots on his roster. Jordan Cameron is playing against Tennessee on the road. Again, with all the turbulence going on in Miami, I don't love really any of the Dolphins players at this point. I think they will turn it around. I think their season is definitely not lost, but Jordan Cameron has not shown anything thus far in this fantasy season that warrants him starting in the flex position as Steve has him currently situated. But again, looking at the matchup here, it's hard to go against Bud's team this week. I love the matchups that he has. He's got a lot of skill players in there that should have big games, so I will take Bud to win and move to 5-1 on the season. Next matchup we will look at is myself at 3-2 versus Dave, who comes in with a record of 2-3. Big win for him last week against Sean. Looking at my team, Brandin Cooks finally had a big game last week. It was about time. I know that there are a lot of high expectations for Brandin Cooks, myself included, for this particular season. He is playing in tonight's game at home against Atlanta. Certainly Breeze has looked human the last few games now, but I think this is a game where Brandin Cooks could see a lot of activity. I think he's going to get a lot of catches tonight and hopefully breaks into the end zone for a touchdown. So I'm going to hold out hope that Brandin Cooks will have a good game this week. Looking at the downside, Jason Witten is actually on a bye this week for Dallas, so that means Drew had to pick up Zach Ertz, who is playing at home in the Monday night game against the New York Football Giants. Had a good game last week, but has been very inconsistent, as has the Philadelphia offense. Here's hoping that he can turn it around, but ultimately the weakest position right now for Drew's roster this week is at the tight end position, and that would be occupied certainly by Zach Ertz. Looking at Dave's team, I think this is a big game for Dante Moncrief. Knowing what I know about the Patriots and against the Colts, they tried to take away T.Y. Hilton last year, and I believe they will try to do the same thing again this year. So I would expect to see a lot of Butler on T.Y. Hilton, which should open things up for Dante Moncrief, who had certainly a rough game for Dave last week, but I think he will bounce back. I think he will get a good amount of catches in the Sunday night game at home against New England. On the downside, looking at a former New England player, Shane Vereen, had a big game last week. He had 25 points, primarily catching passes out of the backfield against San Francisco. Inconsistent, again, I get the idea of starting him again with the injuries at the Giant wide receiver core. It seems like a good start for me. I think it's just the weakest point in Dave's lineup. I was looking at Greg Olsen also against Seattle, but I'm going to go with Shane Vereen just because you don't know if he's going to be part of the game plan. You don't know if they're going to go with Jennings or Andre Williams. There's a lot of options there in that backfield. Looking at this matchup, I think it's going to be a close ball game here, but I think Drew's running back should give him enough to get by with a victory, and that would put him to 4-2, bringing Dave's record to 2-4. Now, finally, we'll bring you to the matchup of the week. That will be 3-2 Dennis versus 3-2 Cam. So it's a very important matchup in terms of the playoff positioning for these two gentlemen. First, looking at Dennis's team, a guy that's really started off really hot to begin the year, but has really tailed off the last 3 weeks, is Jordan Matthews. He is going up against also the New York Football Giants at home in the Monday night game. I think Jordan Matthews is going to have a big week. Sam Bradford started to put it together for the Eagles last week. I think they're about to go on a little run here. So for me, Jordan Matthews continues to lead the team in targets, and I think he will translate those targets into positive plays for Dennis's roster this week. On the downside, first of all, Dennis is starting 3 Jacksonville Jaguars this week, which is just unbelievable. So I'll pick one of those 3. I'm not going to pick the easy ones, Blake Bortles and Hearns. I'm going to go with TJ Yeldon, who is at home against Houston. The reason why I'm going to put Yeldon in that category is he actually is coming off a groin injury. He's been limited in practice. I believe he has practiced, but he's in a limited capacity. So it's just, for me, it's an injury situation. And ultimately, I had to pick one of those Jaguars, Dennis. You're starting 3 Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, let that sink in to the rest of the League of Legends teams here. Looking at the Cam's roster, the opposite side, I like Eddie Lacy this week to have a big week. He had a down week last week against a tough defense. That is not the case this week. He will be playing at home against San Diego. Again, I expect Green Bay to jump out early in that game, which means Eddie Lacy should be in line for a very large performance on Sunday. Also, looking at Cam's roster, I'm going to stick with the same position. On the downside, Chris Ivory, who is at home against Washington. Now, the Jets are coming off a bye week. They looked pretty good thus far in the season. Chris Ivory's had a couple of strong games, including his last game where he had a huge game against the Dolphins in London. However, Washington is actually pretty good against the run. Their defense isn't as bad as people think it is. So I think it's going to be tough sledding for Chris Ivory on Sunday. I don't think he'll find the end zone. I think he's going to be really battling it out for yardage in this game. I could see him getting somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 carries, 65 yards, 70 yards, something like that. So that's not going to be enough for Cam. And when I look at this matchup, I say to myself, this is going to be a close game, and I'm going to go with Dennis to win this. With 3 Jaguars starting in his lineup, I'm going to go against common knowledge and take Dennis to win this matchup of the week. Dennis, maybe you'll even get to pick a song. Who knows? But there you have it, folks. That is the action as I see it. I hope everybody enjoys their week. I will certainly do my best to enjoy my time in South Florida. Enjoy the action this week, everybody. Have a great one.